Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendi.
Welcome to Unleashed. I'm Wendi, and I'm your host today. I am so excited to welcome Maria Ross to our Unleashed podcast today. She is just a plethora of information. She's a dynamic speaker, author, business strategist. She has an incredible story. She's an empathy advocate who's on a mission to prove that compassion and business success go hand in hand. Maria's latest book, The Empathy Dilemma, and her acclaimed podcast, The Empathy Edge, explore how leaders can balance performance, people, and personal boundaries to achieve radical success. With a career spanning keynotes at TEDx and the New York Times to workshops for companies like Salesforce, Maria is here to show how empathy can transform leadership and fuel growth. So, Maria, I cannot wait for our conversation today. Welcome to Unleashed.
Thank you so much, Wendi. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a great, before we pressed record, I'm like, I would like to keep it to 45. I don't think there's any way we're going to keep it to 45. So I'll just warn our listeners in advance. This is going to be a phenomenal conversation. So I'm really excited.
I love it. Grab a cup of coffee. We're going to be here a while.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, your TEDx starts with we're just going to start right out here, Maria. And, when I listen to your TEDx, it starts out talking about your near-death experience. And, what a story. Would you share this story with our listeners and just tell us how this really created a path forward for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the year was 2008, and my husband and I had just been married almost 2 years. We had moved to a new city. We bought our first house. We adopted a dog, and I started my business there. I'd had a long career in marketing on both the client and agency sides, and I decided to hang out my own shingle and start my own agency. And there was a lot going on in our lives. And long story short, a combination of genetics and stress and the pace of life led to me having an undetected brain aneurysm rupture and almost kill me. So I was lucky enough that I had had symptoms for like a month and a half, ironically. But the doctor just thought it was stress. He told me to go to yoga and go get some acupuncture, never did a scan. And this one particular day where I was too sick to go and work at my client, my husband decided to come home from work early that day since I wasn't feeling well. And luckily he was home when I collapsed on the bathroom floor, got me to a hospital right away. They did emergency life-saving surgery. I had some other, forward movement and then 3 steps back while I was in the hospital. I was in the hospital about 6 weeks. And then I began the work of recovery. I had a miraculous recovery. I was very, very fortunate. Had that happened to me 10 years prior, the procedures that saved my life wouldn't have been used. So I began my recovery. I slowly got back into my life and back into my work again and built my business back up. But what was remarkable to me about the experience was we had an amazing experience at the hospital, which saved my life. As I mentioned, I was there for 6 weeks. And so when I got better, I decided to volunteer at that hospital as a patient advisor. And when I got a look under the hood as to how that hospital operated, I realized I wasn't just lucky that my care team was so empathetic and kind and respectful. It was actually intentional. It was operationalized empathy. And it was a way of training their people. It was a way of crafting communications. It was a way of getting patient advisors involved to get the patient point of view and really put patients and their family at the center of the care experience. And so I was very moved by that and also very interested in how an organization as bureaucratic as a hospital could make empathy scale in that way. And so that combined with some other factors, later, I had a son, and I was very disheartened, as you heard in the TEDx talk, to be reading him stories about empathy and compassion when our leaders that we were seeing in the headlines and in the news weren't practicing empathy. So I decided to research it and say there's got to be some connection here between my experience in this organization that was able to intentionally scale empathy and the ability to win from a business perspective. There had to be leaders and brands who were winning with empathy, and the data and the research were out there. And I was basically my mission began to curate that information and share it with my own clients, with leadership teams at keynotes, and show people that empathy was not only good for society, but it's actually really great for your business.
Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to unpack there. I don't even know where to start,
I was like, how
Maria.
do I sum that up into a
Yeah.
little tight little narrative for you there? But
Well, first of all, the experience that you had with adversity comes innovation. And
Mhm.
I just appreciate so much that you were able to take something that potentially tragic and, oh my goodness, 6 weeks in a hospital.
Mhm.
And for you to be able to take that and, as you say, operationalize empathy, that
Mhm.
just gives a picture for these businesses. Dig into that just a little bit of operationalizing empathy. What is empathy and how do you bring that into a culture, into a leadership team? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I spend a lot of my time debunking the myths of empathy. So I'm glad you kind of gave me that entree to explain what we mean by empathy. And there's a lot of different definitions out there. The definition has changed over time based on what we know about the brain and what we know about psychology. But the lens that I do my work through that makes the most sense and is most accessible to folks in business is that empathy is the ability to see, understand, and where appropriate, feel another person's perspective, and then to use that information to act with compassion. So there's a couple things there. Number one, empathy is actually both cognitive and emotional. Many of us believe that empathy is just crying on the floor with your employees, and that's not the case. You can access empathy through just a brain exercise of the cognitive empathy is just imagining what something might be like for someone. What questions might they have? What feelings might they be feeling? Emotional empathy is when we think of empaths, right? You actually start feeling and taking on the feelings of the person that you're speaking to. So both of those things can lead to you getting information. I like to tell executives it's a method of information gathering so that you know someone's context, you know where they're coming from, you know why they think and feel the way they think and feel. And now, based on the information I am gathering, I can take a next right step. And that's where compassion comes in. Compassion is actually empathy in action. Now that I know what's going on for you, I can determine, do you need space? Do you just need me to listen? Do you need me to help you solve a problem? Do you need us to try to find a compromise? Like, what is it that we can do to move the relationship forward? Empathy is not just being nice. You can be nice, but not see someone else's perspective. Empathy is not caving into crazy demands or unreasonable demands, because that would be submission. That would be people pleasing. We can make tough business decisions with empathy, with considering the human beings that are impacted and how they feel and what they need for support. And that's why, many months ago, I'm not even sure when, I did a podcast episode with someone that talked about doing layoffs with empathy. So you don't have to go back on your tough business decisions to be an empathetic leader. And then empathy is not even agreeing with someone. I can disagree with your point of view or the strategy you want to implement or the budget decision you want to make. But I can listen, I can ask questions, I can try to find out your point of view. So again, maybe we can find a path forward and find common ground. But I don't have to be, I like to say empathy is about connection, not conversion.
Hmm. Connection, not conversion. So does that mean, I mean, you've talked about it a little bit. Does that mean we wouldn't necessarily change the decision? How we go about that decision is going to be different, and therefore the outcome, in other words, how that person feels may be a little different. They're still going to get laid off. How they
Yeah.
feel about the company, that leader, that person may be different based on whether or not we have empathy. Am I understanding that
That's
correctly?
exactly right. And, I have an example from my own past of a time that one of my most empathetic leaders had to lay off the entire marketing team. But the way he did it was what enabled, he's still a mentor and a colleague to this day. And this was decades ago. Um, understanding thinking ahead, how he was going to communicate the layoff decision to us, thinking of what we might need in that moment and being prepared. Here are some resources, here's some support, here's what I can do to help you move forward or find a new position, leaving space for us to vent. And, just being genuinely human with us this isn't required if this is not, if you're not touchy feely, but for him, he welled up with tears telling us the news. And all of that led to, this is something we don't want to happen, but the way that it happened left us feeling whole. It helped us be prepared for the next step. It wasn't just, hey, we're laying you off. If you have any questions, let us know, right?
Yeah, call HR.
Call HR, right. So I think that we need to understand I always go back to a lot of analogies, and I hate to be like patronizing about this, but it's very akin to parenting, right? I mentioned to you before we started recording that I just moved this summer. And so we moved our 10-year-old from the only home he's ever known.
Wow.
Now, he was not happy about it, but that didn't mean that we changed, oh, honey, you're so upset about this. Forget it. We're not going to move. We'll back out of buying the new house. We'll back out of all the decisions we've made just because we want to make you happy. No, it was about bringing him along with us on that journey and recognizing his feelings. I know this is hard. This is hard to leave your friends. It's hard to make new friends. It's hard to go someplace that you've never been before. What can we do to work together to make that transition easier for you? And giving him lots of space to feel his feelings and also ask questions. And so curiosity is the number one trait of empathic people. And it's because you ask the person what's going on for them. What do they want to talk about? What do they need? What do they need to say? What questions do they have? And get them talking more and more. Tell me more are the 3 magic words. Like, get someone talking, get them talking some more, get them talking some more, to find out what is actually going on for them. Because often what you think is going on for an employee or even a manager, like if you're the employee and the manager, it might not be what it seems at the surface. You have an underperforming employee, for example. The answer is not to berate that person in their performance review. That doesn't help you accomplish your goal of getting the person to be productive and perform. What will help is tell me how you think things are going. What's going on? Tell me what's going on. You could discover that they need some upskilling. You could discover that they've got an elderly parent at home that they're trying to take care of while they're trying to do their job. You could find out that there's a conflict between them and a coworker. You can find out all sorts of things that are not just about you're a bad employee, right? And if the goal, again, is to get performance, if the goal is to meet the objectives of the company and of the team, it's in your best interest to find a way to accomplish that rather than just, be right or punish or yell at someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going in 2 different directions in my head right now, and so the first direction is I'm having a flashback. I worked with Godiva Chocolates, and Erin Clark at the time was their vice president of retail. She was amazing. I remember the eggnog praline biscuit things that were just, oh no, they were truffles, eggnog truffles, amazing. Anyway, that's a side note. She gave a story, and this was years and years and years ago. And when she was performance managing someone from a corrective perspective, where they needed to correct behavior and it was getting serious, I had never equated this analogy that she gave to empathy, and it's really what it was. She would sit down with them and she would say, "Okay, here's the situation," and she would always say situation, not the problem. She would always say situation.
Right.
If you and I were driving in a car, and I knew the road very, very well, and you were driving and you don't know the road, and I knew that there was a really sharp curve ahead, and you're going way too fast to be able to make that curve, would you want me to yell stop?
Yeah.
And that's where we are. And that was just such a great, I think, I don't know, would that be an example of empathy?
I think so. I mean, yeah, that's definitely her sharing a story with that person and trying to then hopefully prompt that story to get that person to open up. Empathy is really about seeing things from the other person's perspective and trying to find out what is going on for them. So I love that story because it is an empathetic approach to starting the conversation and maybe making the person feel comfortable opening up and not feel like, oh, I'm not here to just get yelled at. I'm here because somebody actually cares about me. That's kind of what that story says to me.
Okay.
But it's really about trying to understand that there could be a variety of reasons, but it doesn't mean you don't hold someone accountable. And this is why with my new book, The Empathy Dilemma, I have 5 pillars for being both empathetic and effective as a leader at the same time. One of those pillars you kind of just got to is clarity. Do your people actually know, you can't hold someone accountable for an expectation you've never clearly set. So do they clearly know what's expected of them? And not job description,
Right.
but career progression maps are actually an empathetic way to lead. Doesn't seem like it, right? We think it's like hugging people and talking about our emotions. But
Right.
being clear with your communication is empathetic because you don't leave someone in anxiety or stress because they don't know what they're supposed to do next and they don't know what their goal is. So a clear vision, a clear mission, a clear purpose, as I said, career progression maps, clear norms of the culture. A lot of team cultures have unwritten rules. You should not have unwritten rules. They should be written. They should be discussed. They should be articulated.
Yes.
So that then when you have the performance evaluation discussion that's difficult, you're not wasting time with, I didn't know that. Now you
Yes.
can go to, so help me understand, you knew this was our purpose. You knew this was the goal of the project. Did you know that this piece was expected from you and what it was going to impact down the road? And if they say, no, I didn't realize that my piece of the project was going to impact so much down the road, that's a leadership failure.
That's right.
That's not necessarily a performance failure. So it's really about being crystal clear. So when you have those conversations, you're what's the word I'm looking for? You're diffusing the emotion out of it.
Yeah.
You're sort of saying like, let's sit down and look at what we said was expected and what we said were our norms and how we said we were going to operate as a team. Has something changed for you that this is not what you're delivering because it's actually causing a lot of stress for the rest of the team? So, our goal here is not to punish you. Our goal is figure out what's going on and fix it.
Yeah. Well, and that goes, I talk a lot about, I just don't believe that the majority of people wake up in the morning wanting to suck.
Oh my God, I say that all the time. We don't want to go to work and fail every day. Yeah, no one wants to.
So if there's something they're not doing, more than likely, so often managers and leaders say, well, you just need to do better. You just need to sell more. Okay. I honestly believe that if they knew how to do that, that they would do it because I don't think the majority of people wake up going, I just want to fail.
Yeah.
So what you're saying makes so much sense that, this creates a culture of accountability because the first question I'm asking is, number one, do they know what to do? Do they know how to do it? And how do I know? What have I done as their leader to make sure that they have the skills, ability, and knowledge to be successful? And I think so often, if we look at ourselves first, it's a completely different outcome. And I never thought of that as part of empathy.
Yeah. And it's not really about coddling the person or letting someone get away with bad performance, because if you do that, this is why one of the other pillars is decisiveness. And that means not being a dictator, but synthesizing multiple points of view, but then swiftly making a decision. And what that also means is not delaying difficult conversations or difficult decisions in the name of being compassionate, in the name of being kind, because you're not being empathetic when you delay those decisions. You're not being empathetic to the rest of the team who's suffering from a poor performer.
That's right.
And you're also not being empathetic to the person who is exhibiting the poor performance because maybe they're in the wrong role. Like you said, they don't want to come to work and fail every day. So you need to address those problems before they fester. And what I've seen with a lot of leaders that say they're burning out because they're so empathetic is they're actually not practicing empathy in its truest sense. What they're doing, like I said earlier, is something more akin to submission or people pleasing. And then they have to look at themselves to say, why am I engaging in that behavior?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So as you're talking, I'm thinking of another example that I'm wondering if this is where we're going with empathy, and that's, a customer example. So, a customer comes in, I do a lot of work with retail. And so a customer comes in and they are just fuming. They're really,
Mm-hmm.
really angry about an online experience they had, and then they tried to return it, and then they couldn't return it. And I
Yep.
mean, they're just so angry. And, it's really difficult as the person in the store to diffuse that anger. And so what we talk about is the iceberg theory, because so often it's not what just happened. It's that they woke up in the morning, they got a flat tire, then they ran out of gas, then they couldn't return their item that they wanted to return, and then they had to fight parking and traffic, and now they get to the store. And so one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that I will say is, as soon as you start to see that anger, say, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry." Stand in their shoes. Tell me more. And those three words that you said. And as they start to say, "Oh my goodness, okay, what happened then?" Tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. Eventually, what happens is literally you see that consumer start to take a
Yes.
breath and go,
The
"Okay, what?"
temperature of the conversation goes down when you do that
Yes.
because now they're being heard. And that's three-fourths of the battle.
Mm,
I just, given your audience, I just want to share in my previous book, The Empathy Edge, I talked about building empathy because how it strengthens you as a leader, how it strengthens your culture, but how it strengthens your brand. Because my background is brand strategy,
mhm,
and I just want to share some statistics with your audience. There was a study, two studies done a few years ago. 97% of customers say that empathy is the most important element in customer engagement. And in this study, they talked about even if their problem was not necessarily solved the way they wanted it to be solved, right?
uh-huh.
9 in 10 want brands to show empathy through their behavior.
Mm,
And 86% say that empathy is the biggest driver for customer loyalty. And that number's so
really?
high because the bar is so low. Like
It's
when
so
you have
true. Oh,
when you have an empathetic experience with customer service, again, even if your
oh,
problem is not necessarily solved in the way you wanted it to be solved, you talk about it. You write
that's
online
right.
reviews. You
That's right.
tell your friends, like, oh my gosh, this credit card company did this for me. This boutique did that for me.
Mm,
You actually become evangelists if you have an empathetic experience. And it starts with just acknowledging the feelings and not blaming. And years ago, I wrote a blog post about this. Years ago, I had this horrible experience with an online company. Um, it was a boutique selling like women's clothing and like bras and panties and things like that. And they were a media darling. And so I decided to try them. And I ordered something for my brother to wear to my brother's upcoming wedding. And I paid extra to get it in time, to get it
mhm.
overnighted. And I didn't get it. And when I called, first of all, my emails went unanswered when I was trying to email customer service. So I actually, made some time to get on the line and call. And when I called, the person who answered the phone, their first response was, "Well, you must have filled out the form wrong because we don't have that we were supposed to FedEx it to you or whatever." And so right then and there, you're like, okay, so not only am I mad and I don't have this item, but now you're telling me I'm wrong. And then I
Whoa.
said, no, I did because I got confirmation that it said this. And then their next response was, I was like, I've been trying to email. I've emailed several days in a row. The response was, well, we've been getting so many orders from other customers that we just can't, you just need to be patient, basically was the message. And I wrote this blog post because I'm like, I don't care how successful you are. If you can't serve your customers,
That's
that's
right.
your own business model flaw.
Mm,
Like
mm,
you need to fix your customer service process so that you can serve all these customers. That's not a valid excuse to say, this is why we haven't
mm.
gotten back to you. Right. And all
Right.
it would have taken was a shift in, we're so sorry this happened. Let's see what we can do to make it better. This woman just wanted me off the phone. Like I was a problem, right? I have never bought from that company again. And I've told everyone about this
A
experience.
100%. Yes.
So, I don't know if like my own experience was a fluke or an outlier, but the point is I actually really liked the product once I got it. And I would have ordered more from them
Hmm.
had that not been my customer service experience. So it's really just about acknowledging where someone is. They're allowed to feel what they feel. They're allowed to think what they think from their perspective and their lived experience. The way you go about trying to navigate the situation is given that information, Now, can you at least acknowledge? And once you acknowledge, maybe they're going to be a little bit more open to
Mm-hmm.
hearing what might be a solution that you can offer. But, brands would are killing themselves with
Yeah,
really good products because they are just hiring bodies and not
right.
training people on
That's
how
right.
to diffuse conflict. I interviewed someone on my podcast a while ago who specializes in working with groups that have customer service organizations, like attractions, like city attractions,
Hmm.
where they have high turnover. And what she hears is, well, we don't want to invest in this because it's not worth it. Those people are going to leave us in a couple months. But what about all the customers they've impacted in
That's
that
right.
couple of months that they're there that you've now lost for life?
Yeah. Oh, Maria, I hear that every day of my life with executives saying, we have very high turnover. And so what if we spend all this time and money and energy and resources in training and then they leave? And my
Yeah.
response is always, what if you don't train them and they stay?
Yeah. Or what if you don't train them and for the 3 months they're there, they ruin your brand,
That's
right?
right. Because one customer complaint, just like yours, and before we know it, we're, online and
Yeah.
Google reviews and yeah. So,
I want to
wow.
can I just add something to that? Because Wendy, I think
Yes.
this is super interesting. I interviewed the chief learning officer for TBWA, the worldwide ad agency, and they invest very heavily in training and professional development for their people. And they know they're eyes wide open. She said, look, we know we might only have these people for 4 or 5 years. What we want to do is we want them to be the most productive and the most impactful they can be in the 4 or 5 years that we have them. And when they go, because they're not going to necessarily stay here for life, when they
Hmm.
go, we want this to be the best experience they've ever had. And we want the people they have worked with and the clients they have served to have had the best experience they ever had. And that's why they invest in them. They know that someday they're going to leave, but it doesn't matter. While they have them, they want them to be at maximum capacity.
So, Maria, I love that this just has so many different legs to it because it's not just empathy is not just for consumer focused roles. It's not just
Mhm.
for leaders who have people who, they are leading. It is,
Mhm.
for those of you who are married, I can see how the divorce rate would go
Relationships.
down
Yeah.
tremendously if we could
Yep.
just figure out this empathy thing. And,
Yeah.
I was thinking this morning that even a year ago, if I'm to be really honest, I don't think, I've been in sales since I was 15 years old. So, just a few
Mhm.
years ago. Um,
Mhm.
we've never talked about empathy in the selling process. I've been working with executives for almost 3 decades.
Mhm.
Until about a year ago, we really weren't talking about empathy. And, one of my favorite books is The Tipping Point. And so I'm always curious about, what are the tipping points? What are the catalysts for different things that, yesterday it wasn't a thing and today it's all we're talking about.
Mhm.
And so I don't know, maybe it's confirmation bias that I was looking for empathy, and I have been in
Yeah.
the last couple of years or in the
Yeah.
last year. All of a sudden, it seems like empathy is everywhere. Everybody's all of a sudden talking about, especially empathy and leadership. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on what's been the catalyst of empathy all of a sudden being a conversation?
I love this question. First of all, just side note, it's just from a sales perspective, I speak at sales kickoffs a lot. And it's because empathy combined with ambition are it's the number one combination of traits for successful salespeople. More
Oh,
than
that's
more than knowing the
huge.
more than knowing the product and more than a good pitch. So just want to put that out there. We could have a whole nother episode about empathy
Oh,
and
let's
sales.
do
But
that.
but so here's the thing. I love that you noticed this because I started my research in about 2016. And when I started shopping the first empathy book around, The Empathy Edge, which was the business case for empathy, I had agents who were very interested in the book but didn't get it. They were like, I don't understand. Is it a business book or a self-help book? And I'm like, no, it's a business book. And they wanted me to change it. They were like, we love your writing, but can you make it about not empathy, but female traits, how feminine traits help you be successful? And I'm like, no, because empathy is a gender neutral trait. We're all born with it as human beings. Like, no. And then there were the trends in culture change that were already happening, where it was like, trying to make culture more people focused, people starting to realize that we don't park our humanity at the office door when we go to work. But then what happened was the pandemic. So lockdown happened, and all of the sudden, people understood my work. People started to understand the need for empathy, or they were going to, the company was going to fold in the midst of the pandemic. We had people whose very lives and livelihoods were threatened. Collectively, globally, our lives were all impacted by the pandemic. And that culture conversation about putting your people first got accelerated. And then all of a sudden, everyone understood empathy. Like one of my best years of my business was that year during the lockdown.
Really?
Because I had the book and they were like, we need a workshop. We need a leadership training. We need to help our people understand how to apply empathy right now because we're losing people. And when you look at the benefits of empathy on your organization, things like boosting engagement, performance, collaboration, innovation, any of those companies during the pandemic that didn't understand having empathy for their employees during that difficult time lost valuable people, lost valuable bottom line revenue, lost customers because they didn't get the connection that empathy actually does belong at work, because any place where you have humans interacting with other humans is where you need empathy. And so it's not about just that's for your personal life, not the way you run your business. And when you look at, again, empathy showing up in these operational ways that are not just the crying on the floor, like I said, career progression maps, flexible work schedules, mental health benefits, those are all examples of empathy at work. So it doesn't have to be something you're potentially uncomfortable with, but that's really where the catalyst got accelerated. So the conversations about human-centered culture were already in the works. They were just really slow to adopt. And then when we had the lockdown, when we had the pandemic, it all got accelerated. And now you're hearing it from way more people than me, which is a good thing. I think we need to amplify that conversation.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, especially in leadership. You know, we've always talked about influence and inspiration and integrity, and all of those are pretty common leadership characteristics. And now, one of the most important leadership characteristics is, in fact, empathy. And so I hadn't thought about that being a connection with COVID. That makes perfect sense. And now, what I'm hearing is, you know, the whole return to office. You know, now I would think that would be something where empathy is going to be really important because it's the two extremes. So now you're not at the office, now you're returning to the office, and now you're having to change your life. And, you know, I even read an article that someone said, you know, by you requiring me to return to office, that's actually part of diversity because it's diversity of thought. You're not listening to what I think. And I mean, wow, what a difficult thing for companies today to navigate through this change of culture. And I just wonder how different the outcome would be if these leaders in their return to office strategies included empathy.
Yeah, and you know, this is the thing that we're seeing post-pandemic as well as we sort of come out of this is a little bit of fear and insecurity in leaders rearing its head in that some of them just want to go back. They want to go back to the status quo. Like in my book, I joke about this attitude of you've had your fun being treated like humans. Now it's time to get back to work, right? So we are seeing a snapback to bossism. We're seeing a snapback of leaders who don't know how to lead in the new culture and the new workplace environment, saying, well, I only know one thing, and that's I need everybody inside four walls. But we've already proven that we can innovate and be creative outside of four walls. We've shown the world that companies did really well and innovation did not halt when everyone was home.
In fact, quite the opposite. We became more innovative.
Exactly. We opened up our talent pools to people that wouldn't be able to come into the office. We found the right talent wherever they were. Now, it's funny because I argue both sides of this. So this is my arguing the like, hey, you need to try to be flexible. You need to listen to people. How are they doing their best work? Do you really want your people facing a 2-hour commute again when they don't really need to? So yes, to your point, empathy is really important there. And I spoke to the CHRO at Box, and they're doing a great job with experimenting with different models of hybrid as they get feedback from people. So they're like, none of us have been through this before, and you have to have a design thinking mindset. Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's try this. What do people think? Oh, that's not working for them. Let's try this other thing. Let's figure out what we can do in the office to entice people to come back to the office and make it easier for them to collaborate in the office. So they're doing things to the actual physical environment and the physical space, but they're experimenting. And I love that she was like, no one's got a lock on this. If anybody says they do, they're lying,
That's right.
because it's about experimenting what's right for your culture and your people. Now, what I will say is I'm going to argue the other side. And that is, when companies are clear about how they want to do business, when they're clear on their brand and their values, and they are making a tough business decision for whatever reason, like, yes, we need to get everybody back in the office 5 days a week or 4 days a week, they are perfectly within their right to make that business decision. Now, employees have to have agency and empathy to say, I need to decide if this is still the right place for me. If they are privileged enough that they can go somewhere else, right? Because I recognize that that's not always a possibility for everybody. But we can't always expect the business to change for us. If they are making a business decision that they believe is in their best interest for sustainability, then now you, employee, have to decide if you want to stay there or not. And if that's still the right place for you, that aligns with your lifestyle and your values, right? Just because you decided to move to Mexico during lockdown and now everybody wants everyone back in the office, that's kind of not the company's problem at this point. So
Yeah.
I tend to argue, I think because I'm seeing the empathy from both sides, I see the empathy for the leaders that are making some tough business decisions. I know leaders, for example, of some companies that they legally can't do business in certain states, right? So if you decided to move to a state during lockdown where there were some exceptions, but now we're getting back to normal, it's like, sorry, like we legally can't have you as an employee there.
Yes. Yeah.
So now you have to make a decision. Do you find another place to go that is more in alignment with your goals and your values and your lifestyle?
Mm. So as we are unpacking, a leadership perspective and also an employee perspective, one of the statistics that I read recently is I think it was in Harvard Business Review, and it said 78% of senior leaders are starting to acknowledge the importance of empathy. Only 47% believe their companies are effectively practicing it. So,
Yes.
this gap
Huge
between
gap.
leaders' perceptions
Yeah.
of their empathy and employees' experiences, and it's really highlighting an opportunity for leadership development. So, is this what you would say is due to empathy deficit? I think you call it. Is that what this is?
Well, there's also another study by Business Solver. It's the State of Workplace Empathy Report. They've done it for 9 years. So there's a really good track record of trends and data. And the 2024 and the 2023, quite frankly, report showed this huge empathy gap of, CEOs going, yes, our culture, I can't remember the percentage, but yes, our culture is very empathetic. Our business has been very empathetic, thinking again towards the flexibility they showed in the pandemic. Meanwhile, HR leaders and employees had a much different perception of whether the company was being empathetic or not, or whether leadership was empathetic or not. So that's sort of like a rose-colored glasses thing, I think, of,
Yeah.
look at how we bent over backwards during the pandemic for people.
Right.
But there also is that gap of, yes, we think it's important. Yes, I think it's something like 80+% of executives feel that empathy does drive financial performance. And yet when you rank the quality or the percentage of empathy of that organization, HR leaders and employees are like, no, this is not what's going on. It's sort of like the C-suite is in this little ivory tower. And so there's definitely a disconnect and there's a huge gap there. And I don't know what that's attributable to. I'm not sure if it's attributable to just the C-suite's perceptions of leadership, if they're not really giving employees a voice, if they're not listening to what's happening, or again, if it's a mismatch of what we mean by empathy. I think that's a big problem with certain companies. And that's why when I work with companies or I advise companies, it's if you want empathy to be a value within your organization, you need to actually practice clarity. And you need to say, what does that mean in our organization? Like, what does that actually look like? And look at it not just from the emotional side, but what are the benefits we're providing? What are the career paths we're providing? What are the resources we're providing? Because many employees often say that empathetic benefits look like flex time, look like PTO, look like mental health benefits.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things that are, again, much more accessible for a company to be able to implement. Then, we just need to make sure everybody cares about each other. That's kind of harder for a company. It's really subjective, right? And I
Yeah.
just want to add, since we're talking about this idea of, the other question I get is, how do we measure our empathy? And the answer is, first of all, you have to define what empathy means in your organization. It could mean a slightly different thing in your organization. It could mean service. It could mean integrity. It could mean whatever it is. Map behaviors to that. But at the end of the day, you don't want to measure empathy. Empathy is a vehicle to get to your goal. So what are you actually measuring that's moving the business forward? If you infuse empathy, how does that actually impact the curve? How does that actually impact the goal you're trying to reach? If it's new customers, if it's renewals, if it's, I don't know, press hits, whatever it is for your organization, what are those things you're trying to measure? And how does creating an empathetic environment, upskilling your leaders to be more empathetic, how does that, once you put those things in place, is that accelerating your goals? Because empathy is a method to get to your goal. It's not necessarily the end goal. You could
Mm.
be a very empathetic organization and be broke, right? So how do we tie in empathy as a sort of as a lever to pull to get to our actual measurable business objectives?
Yeah. Well, and I know you talk about people first and then the
Mm-hmm.
outcomes follow. So, from engagement to employee retention to, we've talked about sales and customer engagement. So it starts with empathy. And I love how you tie that together, that you're not measuring empathy, you're measuring, what is that empathy going to do in these different outcomes that we are trying to achieve? And empathy is probably part of that. It's probably
Mm-hmm.
not the whole story. Because
Right.
to your point, if we have a great empathetic culture and yet I am not training people to do
Mm-hmm.
their jobs well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of like a recipe. Like if you're making cookies, for example, right? Are you measuring the success of the cookies by how much sugar you put in it?
Mm.
Or is how much sugar you're putting in it leading to an outcome of this cookie tasting better than that cookie?
Yeah.
Right. And I know that's kind of abstract to think of it that way, but empathy is kind of the sugar.
Yeah.
You're adding it to the recipe to
Hmm.
overall make the outcome the best it can be.
Yeah. So you work with, it sounds like, all different types of organizations. So I'm curious, when organizations engage Maria Ross for empathy, what's the anatomy of those businesses that are looking to you for help?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, I started as a brand strategist. And so I was working with companies on better connecting and engaging with their customers and prospects. And so I was working with them on brand story and brand messaging, and I still do that. It's more exclusive and more cherry picked because I'm doing mostly the empathy and the leadership training now, and I'm working with HR professionals or employee engagement professionals and things like that. But I would say that the common thread, whether I'm working with a brand client or I'm working to do a leadership training or a workshop or a keynote, is that I'm working with leaders and with teams that are forward thinking, that are looking beyond just how things are done right now to a vision of, we know that we can have a stronger connection and stronger engagement, whether it's our external customers or our internal employees. And we know that that is going to lead, like I was saying before, to our ultimate business objectives. So I'm
Mm.
usually working with people, it sounds kind of trite to say, but I'm working with people that get it, that understand how to connect those dots and say that ultimately that's going to lead to revenue growth. That's going to lead to more market share. That's going to lead to increasing the number of customers that we bring on this year. And they understand that the crux of it is connecting and engaging the right people. And so that's what I would say kind of across the board. And then it doesn't, for me, I'm sure with your work too, it doesn't become a sales pitch. It becomes a conversation where they really understand that this is a catalyst for transformation. They understand that this is a catalyst for their growth, and they're willing to invest in it because they have their eye on the long term.
Yeah. And then it's more, outcomes obviously are important.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about culture though than it is outcome, and changing the culture from the inside out. And you
Yeah.
change the people, you get the right people, give them the right training, and the outcomes come.
Yeah. I mean, when I was doing just strict brand strategy work, I always did have that perspective that brand and culture are two sides of the same coin. You
Yeah,
can't just put a brand veneer on something to the market if
that's right.
it's got to start from the inside out, to your point. And that means you're starting with your leaders, you're starting with your internal culture, and that will eventually lead to a genuine and an authentic brand in the marketplace because we're the world is too transparent now. And really interesting statistics around Gen Z and younger millennials and how they buy. And this was part of my early research for the first empathy book, for the Empathy Edge, that they crave brands that are showing empathy not only to their communities and to the planet and their customers, but to their employees as well. And there were studies done by an organization called DoSomething.org early on in the pandemic, where they were constantly taking the pulse of Gen Z and millennials, younger millennials, how their views of brands were changing with the pandemic. And a lot of, like 17 and 18-year-olds going, I'm not going to shop at that store because I heard what they did to their employees during the pandemic, and that they didn't provide safety equipment, and they didn't give them time off from work if they were sick. When I was 17 or 18, I didn't know how the companies that I spent my money with were treating their employees, but these generations care. And so, it's really about you're going to get found out. So how are you treating people on the inside? Not just what you're saying in your ads or what you're saying in your marketing, but that's, to your point, it's got to start with culture.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a lot about the positive sides of empathy. And as I was preparing for this podcast today, I just did some research on empathy and, where it came from, and what are employees' experiences in organizations with empathy. And I ran across something in Reddit that I'm just wondering if I could read it to you and just get your response, because it seemed real. It seemed like this is this person's experience with this organization. And would that be okay if I just
Absolutely.
read
Yeah.
this to you? Okay, so it's a total
Sure.
sidetrack. I'd love to just make it real. And, I would love to say
Yeah.
that everyone's experience with empathy is just fantastic and all the things that we've
Exactly.
talked about. And it
Exactly.
probably is not. So,
Hmm.
okay, so here we go. So this is from Reddit. Okay, empathy is way too enforced on people, and people need to stop villainizing the lack of empathy. Firstly, before we start, let's just say that empathy does not equal morality, meaning that while you lack empathy, you still can respect people suffering without actually feeling them.
Hmm.
Like, people may call you a psychopath just because you don't feel bad for a victim. But the thing is that you don't know what happened to that victim. You know that it's bad. You acknowledge that they're suffering, and you can do that without empathizing with them. So, my issue is that people will villainize you just because you do not feel bad for an innocent person. But in my opinion, you should just not be forced to feel empathy for those who are innocent and suffering. It's your choice if you want to empathize with someone, and that does not make you evil. Change my view.
I don't want to change their view. Like, honestly,
Yeah.
I think it goes back to really understanding what empathy is and what it isn't. And empathy is not the same as pity. So pity is
Mm,
really about looking at someone usually with a lens of like something bad has happened to them, but you're looking at them from the outside in, and you're sort of distancing yourself like, oh, that's really bad that that happened to you, right? That's pity. That's sympathy. That's, I'm feeling something for you.
yeah, I feel sorry for you, kind
I feel
of.
sorry for
Yeah.
you. Right. Empathy is feeling with. And that's like, hey, just acknowledging, I know this is really hard, and this must be really tough. And I know when I was recovering from my brain injury, for example, in an effort to connect, people would jump in to say, I know exactly how you feel, because one time, like, I recently, I can't remember stuff either. And I have to write everything down and, because I lost a lot of short-term memory. So in an effort to connect, they tell me their own story as if that was my story, but that's not my story. That's not even the same equivalent, right? So not only have they decentered me from the narrative, now we're talking about them and their problem. I call that empathy hijacking. And so, that's people think they're being empathetic by doing that, but they're not. Empathy is really just giving someone, trying to see it from their perspective and giving them space to feel what they feel and think what they think. It can be purely cognitive, as we talked about earlier. It doesn't have to be emotional. I don't have to shed tears. I don't have to lament. I don't have to, I don't even have to give a hug if I'm not a hugger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's where I see that person is, I see what that person is trying to communicate, that maybe for them, it's just a cognitive exercise of like not really wanting to anything bad to happen to somebody, but maybe they're not going to go overboard with their emotions or with, automatically making assumptions about the situation because they haven't talked to that person. Maybe it's a news article they've read or a news story they've heard about. So I don't think the way we experience empathy looks the same for everybody. We've got neurodiversity in the world. So people are only able to access different things within their brain and within their suite of emotions.
Yeah.
So I think that person has a point that sometimes those people are vilified. Like, how can you not cry over hearing that story? How can you not be outraged over hearing what that person went through? It doesn't mean that that person who wrote that letter doesn't see things from that other person's point of view. It's just they're feeling it differently. They're interpreting it differently. And I love what actually that person said about empathy does not equal morality. Because what happens is when you start to say only people who are outwardly empathetic are moral, now you're putting a judgment on how I experience empathy for someone else. And that's not true. Again, some of us are very touchy-feely. Some of us are very analytical and left brain. And we're going to express empathy in different ways. And if we start putting judgments on the way, it's just like saying, the way you experience grief is right or wrong. The way you experience joy is right or wrong. The way someone experiences empathy is not right or wrong. It's just different. As long as we are still trying to take on someone's point of view and trying to move forward together. So I actually kind of agree. It's worded a little bit shockingly, I guess, but I actually agree with that person. And I think for that person, what it would be helpful for them is to understand what empathy is and isn't. And then maybe they would be more willing to say, okay, I am going to practice empathy with someone because I know it's not just me getting over emotional with them.
Yeah. I think that's such an important clarification that I've learned today is it's oftentimes curiosity. It's asking
Mhm.
questions. It's intentionality to
Mhm.
just understand. It doesn't mean we have to agree. It doesn't mean I have to cry with them. It doesn't mean I have to hug them. I appreciate that your approach is it's going to look different based on my capacity and also
Mhm.
based on the situation and who it is that I'm talking to. So
Right.
that just gives so much freedom in just how to stand in somebody's shoes.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up capacity because that's a really important point. With the first two pillars of my 5-pillar structure in the new book, the first pillar is self-awareness. The second pillar is self-care. And the reason the first two pillars are about you and not the other person is because you have to have your own house in order and able to be effectively empathetic. Because if you are running on less than a full tank, there's no space to take on someone else's point of view without defensiveness or fear. It's kind of like when you're tired or hungry, you're not your best self, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Your fuse is super short and you just
Yeah.
can't deal with other people, right? So it's the same thing with empathy. When you are coming at it from a grounded perspective, you are confident, you are secure. Empathy actually requires great strength to take on someone else's point of view without defensiveness or fear. So you have to make sure that your capacity is full. And it all depends on the day. It all depends on the hour. And so there might be moments where I need to be in self-preservation mode right now. I can't be empathetic to what Wendy's going through right this moment.
Yeah. And
And
to be
that's
honest
okay.
about that, I'm
Yeah,
having a
be
hard time feeling
honest.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like
During that,
don't have those conversations with your employees that are those contentious, high stakes conversations. If you know you're tired and you're on your, you've been dealing with your kid throwing a tantrum in the morning and you're just on you're on your last thread, maybe you want to delay that
Mhm.
performance evaluation to another day.
And the transparency of that. I want to
Yes.
be present. I want to be objective and honest and open. And right now, my brain is in 25 different places, and
Yes.
I want to do this when I'm going to have we're going to be able to have a better conversation. I just
Yeah.
think that's so important.
Why are we so afraid to do that? I
I
don't
don't know.
understand why we feel the pressure to like, we need to be able to table a conversation if we need to table the conversation.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm asking you questions now. What do you
Yeah.
think?
I don't, I think, with some of my clients, I think it's a timing thing. Like it's scheduled. I want to check it off my plate. I want to cross it off. We're just going to do it. We're going to plow through instead of being intentional to step back and go, is today the right day? And it's okay if it's not.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I think the more intentional we become as leaders and
Yeah.
the more it's okay to be intentional. I just love this whole leadership evolution because it really is evolving. And I think
Yeah.
there's more resources available. We know the brain more than we ever have. There's a lot of things that contribute to
Yeah.
how leadership is evolving.
And
I
to
could
your,
sit and yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say to your point, I think that's the biggest thing when people go, I don't think it has a place at work, right? It's because we can be empathetic, we can be people focused, but we still always need to remember the goal
Mm,
and be very clear on the goal and the purpose. And I spoke to a C-suite executive for the recent book, and she had a great story for me because I asked her how she balances all this. Does she feel like she has to be her therapist? And she said, absolutely not. My job here is to drive revenue. This is why I'm at the company. This is why I'm here, is to drive growth. And all the people on my team count on me doing my job for them to be gainfully employed, right? For them to be able to do the work that they do. And so, yes, I want to get to know my team. She gets to know them on a very personal level. She's always there for them. It's open door. She wants to know what's going on for them in their life that might be impacting their work. She's like, but at the end of the day, I know I'm not being paid $300 an hour to sit and listen to you talk about your boundary issues with your mother-in-law. That's not my job. That's not my goal. And so in that situation, I need to be able to say, this is really impacting you, but I am not equipped for this.
that's right.
So here's some resources for you, or here's what we can do. Maybe I can make some time to talk to you about this, like friend to friend, peer to peer, but you still have to go do your job.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and those conversations are caring. And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean empathy. And that's one of the things that I'm learning from you today. It doesn't mean taking it on. Sometimes it's going to be
No.
redirecting. Sometimes it's going to be understanding. Sometimes it's going to be, okay, now we talked about it. What are you going to do about it? Okay, let's get back to business.
Yeah.
And I love that your work is helping leaders to do this better and
Hmm.
just to be more intentional because you
Yeah.
are making people better, one person at a time, one company, one culture at a
Trying.
time.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things as I was listening to your TEDx, you call it a Trojan horse leader or Trojan horse leaders into being more empathetic. And
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
just seems to be your mission in the world. So,
I
you
think
know,
so. I think I finally discovered it. So
you
yeah.
know, uh, when will you know that you have made an impact on this world?
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, I really quickly just want to point out I am not perfect at this all the time. Like I might be an empathy expert, but I'm not an expert on empathy all the time. At empathy, just ask like my husband and my child. Like it's always a work in progress. Like I said,
Yeah.
depending on the day,
Yeah.
depending on your mood, depending
Hmm.
on whatever. So, I'm still always trying to put these methods into practice, and it's not easy. This is the thing. I don't want people to think I'm being flippant about it.
Right.
It's not easy, but how will I know I made an impact? Oh my gosh. I mean, I don't know if I will know, except to know that I decided that we have an empathy problem in our world. I didn't decide that. I think I've seen that.
You
And
experienced
so
it as
I
well.
experienced it. And I think that if we can start practicing that skill in the place where we spend the bulk of our time, which is at work. And just say, let's try it here, given that there's all this data on how it actually helps our workplace and helps our business. That naturally is going to spill over into our families and into our communities and into how we function in the world outside of work. And so, one, just the fact that we are talking about empathy at work and that, I've been doing this for several years, and now some of the big players, the big influencers are talking about it. And that's good because clearly it's getting into the vernacular and it's getting into, so that is one way I feel like I'm making a difference. But honestly, I think on a very personal level, if I can raise my son in a way that shows that he can be empathetic and successful at the same time, and he never feels like he has to choose, that whole that whole binary thinking of either or I can't stand it. It's both and leadership.
That's
and
right.
so I guess I will feel like I've achieved my mission if my son grows up to be an empathetic but successful leader.
Well said. I have a 25-year-old son too, and I would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And it's fun, when they get to be the fruit of our labor as well.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
that's the true litmus test for sure. So, there's so much information that you have given, Maria, and I will make sure that your books are in the show notes and your podcast is in the show notes, as well as what's the best way to contact you?
Well, they can look at any of those links, but the best way to contact me would be through LinkedIn. I'm Maria J. Ross, but please put a note that says you heard me on this podcast so I don't think that you're trying to sell me something.
Excellent.
And then I'm also on Instagram a lot, Red Slice Maria. And then folks can join my email list at red-slice.com. That's my hub, my core website. Folks can find out about my speaking and leadership trainings and all that good stuff there.
Okay, good. So we'll make sure that all of that is in the show notes so it's easy for our listeners to get into contact with you and learn more, because there is so much more to learn in this whole idea of empathy. And I've learned so much today. So I just want to thank you for making me better today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, I always want to leave our listeners with a little something. So as leaders, as employees, as just people, as they're listening to this podcast, where do we start?
Where do we start? I think recognizing and acknowledging that empathy is a strength, not a weakness, and making sure that we take care of ourselves so that we can then be there for other people. It's not selfish to know your boundaries and express your boundaries. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. Like we were saying, take a time out, because you're going to show up better for people if you do.
I love the freedom in that. Just be intentional, be aware, hold the mirror up. How you doing today?
Yeah.
And do what you can do. And if you're not great at empathy today, then be better tomorrow.
Try again tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yep.
I know there are several times I've had to call people back and go, you know what? In fact, I called my son back last week and I said, I did a terrible job of listening to you and I gave you a bunch of solutions and that's not what you needed. I apologize.
I love it. I'm so guilty of that all the time.
Well, we have this little thing that now that he's 25, being a mom of an adult is so different. And he'll tell me something, and he's in sales now, and I've done sales training for so long. And so he'll say something to me and I'll immediately want to dive in. And so I've started to stop, and I have this bubble thing that I just take a breath and I'll say, do you want me to respond, or do you just want me to listen? And the more I can do that, the better it is.
The more you can do it at work. I advise leaders, if you have someone that comes into your office ranting or upset or needing to talk, take a pause, take that curious breath and say, this is important to you. So do you want me to see it? Do you want me to solve it? Or do you want me to support you? And solve it, I mean,
or support you.
See it, solve it, or support you. See it, you're just letting me know. Great. Solve it, you actually want me to brainstorm ideas. You are looking for advice. Or support you is you might want some resources to go solve this problem on your own. And then you get the other person to take a beat and go, what do I want? Why am I here?
That's right. It's like, maybe I just needed to talk about it. I don't need anything. Let's go to lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, so good. We could talk about this forever. And I do hope, Maria, that we can do another podcast together. And so I just so want to say thank you for your time and for being on Unleashed today. And I look forward to the next time. So
I do
thank
too.
you again.
Thanks for listening to Unleash with Wendy Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.